Hello, my friends. Today, I want to talk to you about the single most devastating disease on this planet, one that claims many times more lives than cancer. And the truly frightening part is that most people who have it right now have absolutely no idea it is happening inside them. We're going to walk through exactly how it does its damage, why it remains so poorly understood by the very system meant to treat it, and, most importantly, how you can protect yourself starting today. I'm Dr. Arthur Sterling, and if you genuinely want to understand how your body actually works, rather than simply being handed a prescription, stay with me. And make sure you subscribe so you never miss what comes next. This disease causes its damage through a very specific chain of events. It causes fatty liver, physically clogging your liver with fat it was never designed to hold. It triggers chronic, body-wide inflammation. It raises your blood pressure. It raises your blood sugar. It reduces your helpful HDL cholesterol, while increasing the damaging, inflammatory LDL particles circulating through your arteries. It increases triglycerides, the fat sitting directly in your bloodstream. It packs on belly fat and overall weight. And beyond all of that, it weakens your immune system's ability to defend you, and it effectively shuts down autophagy, your body's own internal cleanup crew, the mechanism responsible for clearing out damaged cells and recycling vital components so everything keeps running smoothly. Because this single disease is so directly woven into every one of those mechanisms, it goes on to cause cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, and kidney failure. In fact, it is the leading cause of kidney failure, blindness, and limb amputation in the developed world. It contributes directly to cancer by interfering with your body's natural ability to fight tumor cells. And if you contract a serious infection, it dramatically increases your risk of dying from it. All told, researchers now estimate this single disease is involved in over 95% of all degenerative disease on Earth. So what is this mysterious disease with its hand in nearly everything that kills us? It is insulin resistance. And right now, some of you are thinking, wait, insulin resistance? I had no idea it was this serious. Others are thinking, oh, it's just insulin resistance, and you are already mentally dismissing it. That second reaction would be a genuinely devastating mistake. I need you to stay with me through this entire explanation because insulin resistance is, without exaggeration, the most destructive disease humanity has ever faced. And it is also the most costly, both in raw financial terms and in pure human suffering. Someone might say, well, everyone has to die of something. Those are just old people diseases. True, but this is also about dying slowly over an extended period of agony. With insulin resistance and the cascade of degenerative diseases it triggers, people spend 10, 20, even 30 years in the process of dying. During every single one of those years, they suffer tremendously more than a healthy person ever would. Their quality of life collapses throughout that entire stretch of time. Their energy, their mood, their productivity, every single thing that makes life genuinely worth living. And on top of all of that suffering, it is also responsible for more deaths globally than almost anything else combined. If you look at some of the deadliest diseases on Earth, cancer at 9.5 million deaths, heart disease at 17.9 million, hypertension at 7.5 million, stroke at 5 million, and diabetes at 4.2 million, and add them together, that totals 34.6 million deaths. We can legitimately add these together because they all share one central mechanism underneath them: insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. That combined total is 364% higher than total deaths from cancer alone. One of the single biggest misconceptions about diabetes and insulin resistance is that you either have it or you simply don't. A yes or no switch. In reality, it is entirely a matter of degree, a continuum stretching from full diabetes through pre-diabetes all the way to truly optimal metabolic health. Doctors had to draw a line somewhere, so they decided that once your hemoglobin A1C, your long-term average blood glucose, reaches 6.5% or higher, corresponding to an average glucose around 140 milligrams per deciliter, you officially receive a diabetes diagnosis. And you can go far higher than that. Many people sit at 10, 12, even 15. They classify you as pre-diabetic if your A1C falls between 5.7 and 6.4, and the average pre-diabetic person becomes fully diabetic within 5 years. At the other end of the spectrum, a genuinely optimal A1C sits between 4.8 and 5.1, corresponding to an average glucose of roughly 91 to 100, not your fasting number, which should be even lower, but your average. Mainstream medicine considers anything from 5.3 to 5.6 perfectly fine, simply because it has not crossed the official diabetic threshold yet. But here is the critical thing to understand. If you are not sitting in that optimal range, if you are floating in that 5.3 to 5.6 zone, you are actively slipping. Because if you were truly insulin sensitive, you would be stable, living a sustainable lifestyle your body isn't drifting away from. But if you are slipping, it is purely a matter of time until you arrive at full insulin resistance. That is exactly why anything at 5.3 or above deserves your serious, immediate attention. Now let's look at how widespread this genuinely is. Roughly 30 million people in the United States currently have type 2 diabetes, and globally that number reaches 463 million, a figure expected to double within the next 2 to 4 decades. And I personally believe that estimate is too conservative because so many additional people are already on the road there, sitting in pre-diabetes or actively slipping toward it. In the US alone, 114 million people are officially classified as pre-diabetic. Globally, there's no precise tracking, but the number likely approaches 1 billion. And when we look specifically at people who are quietly slipping toward insulin resistance without a diagnosis yet, we're likely talking about 300 million people in the US alone, and somewhere around 2.2 billion people worldwide. Why can we say that with confidence? Because insulin resistance is the primary driver of weight gain, and over 70% of the US population is currently overweight, with roughly a third of the entire world following the same trajectory. Here is how dramatically these numbers have moved over time. In 1800, obesity was virtually non-existent. By 1900, it had barely begun appearing. But starting around 1960, in the post-war era, growth became explosive and exponential, and we are talking about percentage of the population that is genuinely obese, not merely overweight. Diabetes rates climbed right alongside it, with the same explosive exponential curve. The reason takes time to unfold. It generally takes about 5 years to progress from insulin resistance into full-blown diabetes, and somewhere between 15 and 20 years to travel from very mild insulin resistance all the way to diabetes. While the United States currently leads the world among large nations in diabetes, obesity, and overweight rates, the rest of the world is simply following the identical trend with a time delay. It is only a matter of how far behind they currently sit. So let's talk about how to actually fix this. But first, we have to understand precisely what insulin does and where insulin resistance comes from in the first place. When you eat food, it travels into your digestive tract, gets broken down into progressively smaller particles, and once those particles reach a molecular size, they get absorbed directly into your bloodstream. But here is the critical piece. Those nutrients cannot travel from your blood into your actual cells without insulin. That is insulin's entire job. This is precisely why insulin itself is not the enemy and is, in fact, absolutely essential. Type 1 diabetics who cannot produce insulin at all will die because they have nutrients floating in their blood with no way to deliver them into the cell. Insulin is not inherently bad. It is entirely about balance. One of the biggest reasons insulin resistance remains such a massive problem is that it is so poorly or so incompletely understood. If you search it online, you will find that insulin resistance is described as cells in muscle, fat, and liver tissue simply stopping their normal response to insulin. But the real question almost nobody asks is why? When you hear that a cell isn't responding properly, is the cell just being arbitrarily stupid? Or does that cell have an extremely good reason for beginning to resist insulin? If you have spent any time learning how the body actually works, you already know the body is infinitely intelligent. Every single cell is constantly working to return to homeostasis, operating according to an internal intelligence. There is always a perfectly logical reason behind whatever your body chooses to do. If we fail to understand that, if we assume the cell is being randomly stupid, responding one day and refusing the next, we end up trying to force it anyway, and that forcing is precisely what medication often becomes. If a cell has decided it has had enough insulin and begins actively resisting it, and we force more insulin on it regardless, are we moving that cell toward greater health or further away from it? Are we genuinely helping that cell by overriding its wishes, or are we actively harming it? I think the answer becomes quite clear. When you force your will against what the body is deliberately doing, you are almost always decreasing overall health, not improving it. Let me give you one more way to picture insulin resistance. Imagine this is your house, and one day a salesman knocks on your door. It's been a long time since anyone visited, so you're genuinely excited. You open the door, you chat, maybe you even buy something. All good so far. But what if he comes back again 5 minutes later? Now you're a little suspicious, a little hesitant. And what if he shows up again every 5 minutes for the next several days straight? At some point, you would get genuinely upset and tell him to get lost. You would start actively resisting that salesman. The same exact thing happens with robocalls. I don't know about you, but roughly 90% of the time my phone rings these days, it's some automated voice offering a fabulous deal on credit or car insurance. After enough of these calls, you stop answering, you block the number, and 30 minutes later, that same computer calls you from an entirely different number. Eventually, you simply stop responding altogether. You start resisting those calls completely. That is exactly what happens at the cellular level when insulin shows up too often in too high a quantity. The cell begins resisting it. Insulin resistance is, quite literally, resistance to the action of insulin. And when your cells start resisting that signal, it is a deliberate physiological adaptation, the cell actively trying to restore its own balance and return to homeostasis. Have you noticed how body fat tends to get blamed for absolutely everything? That's partly because nobody wants excess fat sitting on their body. It's genuinely unhealthy, it's burdensome, it's heavy to carry around, and people simply don't like having it. But is fat actually the root cause? If you're carrying excess fat, it's because your body is storing too much of it relative to how much metabolism you have actively burning it off. And that storage process depends directly on something called lipogenesis, your body's own fat manufacturing process. It isn't only about what you're eating in terms of fat content, It's about how much fat your body is actively creating internally. And if your metabolism isn't robust enough, you're simultaneously failing to break down existing fat efficiently, a problem called decreased lipolysis. Both of these processes are direct downstream results of insulin resistance, because the more insulin resistant you become, the more insulin your body is forced to produce just to keep blood sugar under control. But insulin itself is only ever a response to something else. And here, finally, is the actual root cause. Blood sugar is a direct result of sugar and starch. Everyone blames fat, but fat is not the cause, it is the end result. The true root cause is sugar, starch, blood sugar, and the insulin response that follows. How can we be so confident about this? Because we already know precisely what triggers insulin responses in the body. If we assign sugar and starch an index value of 100 for insulin response, protein produces roughly half that response, and fat produces virtually none at all, single digits. On top of that, both protein and fat are deeply satiating, keeping you genuinely full for extended periods, while sugar and starch actively make you hungrier afterward. Some people remain unconvinced because certain studies show fat cells themselves becoming more insulin resistant when researchers measure the signaling molecules they release, so surely the fat itself must be the problem. It may look that way on the surface, but the fat didn't make those fat cells fat in the first place. Insulin did. And it's genuinely sad, because just as we shame overweight people for being lazy or gluttonous, we now shame the fat cells themselves, as if to say, bad fat cell, you shouldn't be insulin resistant. But we're the ones who made that cell fat through excess insulin, driven by sugar and starch, causing fat storage in the first place. The end result is simply a fat, insulin-resistant cell that we then turn around and blame, exactly the way we blame the person carrying it. Despite genuinely compelling evidence, and despite the real-world results so many people achieve through fasting, ketosis, and low-carb approaches, when you check with major health authorities about the cause of obesity, they continue to say it comes down to excess calories, people eating more total calories from fat and sugar than in the past, combined with reduced physical activity. It's the same message from virtually every major health association. So what do they recommend? Reduce calories from fat and sugar. They are 50% right and 50% dangerously wrong. Fat is not the problem, unless it happens to be genuinely poor quality fat, while sugar absolutely is the primary driver. So when they say reduce sugar, that part is correct. But then they say increase calories from fruit, vegetables, beans, and grains. And while non-starchy vegetables like leafy greens and cauliflower are genuinely fine, what they are essentially recommending is reducing fat and carbohydrate while simultaneously increasing carbohydrate, 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 and more carbohydrate. And that, precisely, is the pathway from insulin-resistant to fully diabetic. So what is the healthcare system actually doing about this devastating disease? In the United States alone, in 2020, they spent over $4 trillion on so-called healthcare, and I put that phrase in quotes deliberately because it is not healthcare, it is sick care, pure symptom management. That works out to over $12,000 per person on average, spread across the entire population, including healthy people who rarely use the system. And despite spending more money than anywhere else on Earth, America has more diabetes, more heart disease, more arthritis, more high blood pressure, and more metabolic syndrome than it has ever had before. And as spending keeps climbing, disease prevalence keeps climbing right alongside it. Why? Because the entire system is built around treating symptoms only, never the root cause. The root cause is simply not understood and, frankly, not where the financial incentive lies. The system is interested in managing symptoms, not eliminating them. Do you need even more reasons to take insulin resistance seriously? Think back to the recent global pandemic that captured everyone's attention. The genuinely fascinating thing is that certain groups carried extraordinarily low risk, while others carried extraordinarily high risk. And aside from age itself, insulin resistance was the single biggest factor determining which group you fell into, with older populations simply tending to be more insulin resistant overall. Between the lowest and highest risk groups, death rates differed by up to 100-fold, 100 times more likely to die if you fell into the high-risk category versus the low-risk one. That is an enormous difference. And virtually every single risk factor identified outside of age itself traces directly back to insulin resistance. We have to understand that pathogens are fundamentally opportunistic. They exploit a weakened host, which is exactly why that 100-fold gap exists. Now we're finally ready to talk about what to actually do. But why couldn't we simply jump straight to that list from the very beginning? Because if you don't understand the depth of this devastation, if you don't grasp the true scope of the problem and the mechanism driving it, you'll take that final list of action steps and simply try it. And trying, by definition, means there's no real commitment. You'll attempt it for a few weeks and quietly slide right back into your previous habits. That is precisely why I spend so much time on the why and the underlying mechanism, because once that understanding genuinely sinks in, it starts making real sense, and you can build changes that last a lifetime rather than a few frustrated weeks. Prevention is genuinely simple, and it's about insulin, not calories. It is not how many calories you eat, it is which foods trigger an insulin response, because those specific foods are what drive you to eat more, trigger even more insulin, and spiral forward from there. The simplest dietary rule of all is this: eat real food. That's the entire principle. Eat food the way nature actually made it. Single ingredient foods assembled yourself as much as humanly possible while avoiding fake food entirely. Don't eat heavily processed, packaged products loaded with additives and 37 ingredient labels, because manufactured food isn't truly food. It looks like food, it sometimes even tastes like food, but it doesn't nourish your body. It actively interferes with it, throwing everything out of balance. The biggest reason fake food harms you so significantly is that so much of it is saturated with sugar, and fructose specifically, alongside an enormous amount of processed starch. And then there's the long list of additional additives thrown in: MSG, artificial flavors, preservatives, synthetic colors, and chemical compounds that serve no nutritional purpose whatsoever. If you are currently insulin sensitive, if your body remains genuinely in balance, this is essentially all you need to do to prevent insulin resistance from ever taking hold. But if you are already insulin resistant, you now need to actively reverse it. And while that's not quite as effortless, it remains genuinely simple. You follow every single step above, and then you add 2 additional tools. First, you move toward a low-carb or ketogenic approach to eating, going considerably lower in carbohydrate than someone simply trying to prevent the condition in the first place, because you are already years, sometimes decades deep into this physiological adaptation, pushing your cells toward resistance. The second powerful tool, used alongside the first rather than instead of it, is intermittent fasting. You move from 6 meals a day down to 3 and eventually down to 1 or 2, finding the rhythm that delivers genuine results for your specific body. If you'd like to understand even more about how your body truly works and how to build lasting, genuine health, I'm Dr. Arthur Sterling, and I'll see you in the next video.